Hello everyone, welcome to another video. In this one we'll talk about how to use the engine and wing anti-ice during flight, but also during ground operations. And be aware that even though I'm showing the A319 here, all the things I'm telling you in this video is also valid for the FSLabs A320 and the A321 once it is released. Now, before you watch this video, may I suggest to you that if you haven't already done so, have a look at my first video regarding the engine and wing anti-ice systems, because this video will not go into how the systems actually work. This video shows how the wing and engine anti-ice systems are actually used in practice. So let's dive straight in. And first of all, we'll have a look how the engine anti-ice is being used. So we already know that the front part of the engine, the so-called engine cowling, is being heated by hot pneumatic bleed air. Looking at the overhead panel, we already know where the two engine anti-ice push buttons are located at. The question remains, however, when do we activate the engine anti-ice? And the book says engine anti-ice must be on when icing conditions exist or are anticipated, except during climb and cruise when the SAT, so the static air temperature, is below minus 40 degrees centigrade. And that begs the question, when do we actually have icing conditions? What is the definition here? And so icing conditions exist when the outside air temperature on ground or after takeoff, or the total air temperature in flight, is at or below 10 degrees centigrade and visible moisture in any form is present, such as, for example, clouds, fog, with the visibility of 1 nautical mile or less, rain, snow, sleet or ice crystals. However, icing conditions also exist when the outside air temperature on the ground and for takeoff is at or below 10 degrees centigrade and operating on ramps, taxiways, runways where surface snow, standing water or slush may be ingested by the engines or freeze on the engines, nacelles or engine sensor probes. So that's how the definitions are, but how do we deal with this in the FSLabs A320? Also, of course, A319 and then A321 once it is released. So let's have a look at some practical examples. And first off, we'll start off with a nice and sunny day where the outside air temperature is plus 7 degrees Celsius. However, there's no precipitation and the taxiway's runway is clear and dry. And so needless to say, with these kind of conditions, even though the temperature is below 10 degrees centigrade, there is no need to switch on the engine anti-ice. So let's have a look what happens when the RVR is only, for example, 500 meters and we have only plus 5 degrees Celsius. That, according to the definition, means we have icing conditions, so yes, we will switch on the engine anti-ice. The next one is an easy one. Obviously, we have snowfall. Temperatures are below plus 10 degrees Celsius. The apron is wet, so definitely you will switch on the engine anti-ice in this case. This example is a bit more difficult because we can say it's pretty cold and the apron doesn't look to be wet. However, we can see that the taxiways are not cleared completely, so the engines might actually pick up some snow from the sides. And so in this case as well, you would, as a precaution, switch on the engine anti-ice here as well. And so we come to the last example on the ground. Present temperature is minus 1 degree Celsius. The runway itself is dry, so there wouldn't really be a need to switch on engine anti-ice. However, we can see that the ceiling is at around 700 feet here, and so we will enter clouds shortly after takeoff, and so to reduce the workload during the initial climb out phase, we would already switch on the engine anti-ice at this very moment. Alright, so let's get in the air and have a look how we handle engine anti-ice during flight. Here we are in a descent, descending towards a cloud layer. Temperature is set -2 degrees Celsius total air temperature, and hence, yes, we will switch on the engine anti-ice at this very moment. Okay, another example. We have engine anti-ice on at the current time. We are in a descent. Even though we're still crossing some cloud layers, the total air temperature now is above +10 degrees Celsius, and so we can switch off the engine anti-ice again. Just to reiterate, if you are in a climb or in cruise and the static air temperature, so the SAT, which is displayed also on the eCam, shows -40 degrees or below, then you can also switch off the engine anti-ice. But remember, if you are in a descent, no matter how cold the temperature is, as long as it's colder than +10 degrees total air temperature, you need to switch on the engine anti-ice. Okay, so that concludes the usage of the engine anti-ice. So now let's have a look at the wing anti-ice. However, before we do that, I'll show you two options that you have in the FSLabs menu to either have the ECAM warning displayed regarding icing, or if you are just using the icing indicator between the windshields. For that, we go into the options menu, then flight warning computer STAC, pin programming, and there on the second option you find icing detectors, where they are either enabled, and then you will get your ECAM warnings, like severe ice aggression, wing anti-ice use, etc. Or you can also disable that, and if you disable that option, then you have to look for the icing cues yourself. For example, that icing pin indicator between the windshields. So now the icing detectors are disabled. Next time you restart the plane, you will have only the visual cues here between the windshield on that icing pin indicator. That makes it more realistic because not many aircraft actually have the ice detectors installed, and so most pilots these days are left with looking at the icing pin indicator. And so here's an example of what that actually looks like in the FSLabs. So if you have ice on the icing pin indicator, it looks like that, and then you can be sure that you have ice on the leading edges of the wings, and also of course a stabilizer and rudder, but those parts are not de-iced, only the wing slats 3, 4 and 5. Also here we have the icing detection enabled, meaning that you get an ECAM warning, anti-ice, ice detected, and it tells you to switch on the engine number 1 and engine number 2 anti-ice. So let's have a look how it looks like on the airframe itself. Here we see the engine inlet cowling, and you can see the white areas there indicating ice accumulation. Same applies for the leading edges of the wing. Slowly but surely the ice is building up. The more ice that builds up, the more the performance of the aircraft will suffer. You can also see that at slats 1 and 2, because the wing root is a lot thicker there, the ice accumulation there is not quite as bad. So let's have a look what happens to the performance when you have such severe ice aggression. You can see that now the speed is dropping into the VLS band, pretty much full power. And if we do not act now by switching on the wing anti-ice, the aircraft will stall. So it is very important here in the FSLabs to periodically look at the icing pin indicator to make sure you find the ice buildup early enough. And so having switched on the wing anti-ice right now, we can see the performance is immediately increasing again, and that is due to the fact that the ice that has built up on slats 3, 4 and 5 on both sides has been blown off by the wing anti-ice system. And you can see that here very nicely. Let's talk about engine icing. Engine ice buildup on the engine cowling is a little bit dangerous because then the ice can break off in some part and be ingested by the engine. Can either cause engine stalls or even damages to the blades. And hence, whenever we have visible moisture and icing conditions, so the criteria that we've mentioned in the beginning of the video, when those criteria are met, then we switch on the engine anti-ice, and that way prevent the ice accumulation on the engine cowling. Be aware that if you're on the ground and you have icing conditions and you do not switch on the engine anti-ice, there will be an increase in engine vibrations at some point. That shows you that the fan blades are actually icing up, and there's a little procedure, an ice shedding procedure on the ground, where you put the thrust about 70% every 10 to 15 minutes in order to have the ice then shed off by the centrifugal forces of the spinning fan blades. Right, you do the run up for about 30 seconds and then put the thrust to idle again, and then the vibration levels should be back to normal. And we can see that here already the vibration levels are dropping slowly. Usually during flight you do not have big problems with fan blade icing. The reason is usually the RPM of the engine is above 70%, and so the only time you can expect fan blade icing in flight is during phases where the RPM is fairly low and the airspeed is low as well. So typically, for example, the fan blade icing will happen in a holding pattern when you have moderate or severe icing. Okay, so we are at the end of this video. A lot of information contained in it, I know, and so we'll just refresh everything that we've talked about. So we've learned that icing conditions exist whenever the outside air temperature or the total air temperature in flight is at or below plus 10 degrees Celsius and visible moisture in any form is present. Furthermore, icing conditions also exist on the ground when the outside air temperature is also at or below plus 10 degrees Celsius, and when operating on ramps, taxiways or runways where the surface has snow, standing water or slush, etc. Then we have learned how to use the engine anti-ice. So the engine anti-ice must be on when the icing conditions exist or are anticipated, except during climb and cruise when the static air temperature is below minus 40 degrees Celsius. Now, the wing anti-ice must be switched on in flight when there's an ice accumulation visible on the icing pin indicator, or when the related ECAM caution demands this action. And that depends, of course, which options you have activated in the MCDU. And the wing anti-ice is then being used as long as you have icing indications on that pin indicator. So once the ice disappears from that pin, then you can switch off the wing anti-ice again. And of course you can switch it off as well if the icing conditions have ceased to exist, i.e. when you're flying in clear air without any precipitation. So now we're at the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you to all of you who are supporting my YouTube and my Twitch channel. Until next time, until the next video or the next stream, as always, take care, happy landings.